Mhm.
Okay. Hello and welcome from the Nelson Mandela College of Government and Social Sciences and the Department of Political Science. This afternoon, we have a premier scholar, Dr. Albert Samuels, who will be discussing a very historical and current day event, the second impeachment of our former president, Donald Trump. Dr. Samuels has served on various national, state, and local political news stations and radio stations, and he served as a political analyst for local radio and television here in the city of Baton Rouge in the state of Louisiana. So, with that said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Albert Samuels. And we ask that you please put all your questions in the chat box, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. We also ask that you mute your microphones until the end of the presentation. Thank you. Dr. Samuels?
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, my colleague, Dr. Johnson. And we're going to try to go ahead and get started. I'm going to see if we can share screen. So let's go. Start podcast. Can everyone see?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. So I've been titled this. So what's the point? The second impeachment of President Donald John Trump. Okay. This slide, of course, has the images from the insurrection that took place at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. I mean, we have seen these images for weeks since it happened. These images, in many ways, stunned the nation, and these images were blared around the world of an insurrection happening at the United States Capitol. Many people felt like this was something that was more befitting unstable dictatorships in other parts of the world than in the United States. Reportedly, the longest enduring democracy in the modern world. The world. This insurrection involved supporters of the former president Donald Trump, whose obviously their purpose was to prevent the certification of the electoral college votes, which was a constitutional ritual that is engaged in every 4 years. That's usually routine. In this case, these supporters believed that the election had been stolen, and they tried to use physical force to prevent that from happening. They believed the election had been stolen, that Donald Trump was the rightful winner, and they were there to and they came back with ideas they were going to retake their country. Their country had been stolen from them, and that democracy essentially had failed. You know, 7 people died as a result of this insurrection. Which included a Capitol police officer, Brian Sicknick, 2 other police officers took their lives shortly after what they went through during the insurrection. Over 140 police officers were injured, and some suffered some severe injuries. The more we learn about this event, the more we know that it could have been a whole lot worse. that, that the insurrectionists came within yards of Vice President Mike Pence, who had to be shoveled away by Secret Service agents to protect him. That they came very close to 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 breaching the actual House chamber while members were still in there, uh, in there, and so, uh, but for the heroism of Capitol police officers, this could have been a whole lot worse. We also know that President Trump gave a fiery speech that many would consider a very inflammatory speech, only moments before the riot took place on January 6th, in which he repeated his claims that the election had been stolen, uh, that he urged his supporters to fight, and he said we're going to march to the Capitol, and many of them literally took that to mean that an actual physical assault on the Capitol, where they overwhelmed law enforcement there and penetrated the Capitol with the idea of stopping the count, and uh, and also uh, with plans of even executing members of Congress, uh, executing the Vice President of the United States, Vice President. And so this is what happened. The Capitol of the United States was breached. It was attacked in a way that it hadn't been since 1814, when the British burned the city of Washington down down to the ground during the War of 1812. So that, I mean, I was familiar with these facts, with these facts, and 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 largely because the House of Representatives uh, concluded that President Donald Trump had incited this mob to attack the Capitol. Swiftly, within about on January the 13th, he was impeached by the House. He was impeached by the House of Representatives. Now, this raises the question: then what's to be done? What's to be done? In light of in light of what happened, can a president be impeached? Can an impeached president uh, be tried who is now no longer president? The impeachment occurred on January the 13th, but his term of office expired on January 20th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. He's no longer president, and so for some people that raises the fundamental question. So what is to be done? Even if you believe that this was a terrible act, that the president responsible, what is to be done? Can he be legitimately impeached and tried, even though he is no longer in office? No, in office, and which is basically the question that's raised here. This is, of course, the picture of Senator Rand Paul. He is a senator from the state of Kentucky. Uh, a few days ago, prior to the actual beginning of the actual trial, he introduced a resolution and arguing basically arguing that this entire trial is unconstitutional. Essentially, the argument being made here is that Donald Trump is now the former president of the United States. That his argument is that impeachment, is about removal from office and potentially disqualification from holding future office. The argument here is that, well, if he's not in office, he can't be removed. Therefore, disqualification and this thing is this is sort of irrelevant. So why are we trying him? Uh, this resolution failed. Uh, However, 45 Republican senators did support it. It's supported. So the vote was 55-45. So that in effect, the resolution would amount to what we would call in normal criminal justice system as a motion to dismiss. That resolution failed. Um, However, despite the fact that it failed in many ways, the question is still out there. You know, and does it make sense to try a former president uh, accused of high crimes and misdemeanors, but who is no longer president? Even if the actions or the alleged actions or based on the allegations are for actions that occurred before that president left office. Does it make sense to try that person? Is it constitutional to do this? Uh, and Rand Paul's position and the position of some of his colleagues took does have a common sense logic to it. After all, some people might argue, well, what's the point of removing him from? What's the point of impeaching him if he can't be removed? Since he's no longer president. Uh, some have suggested that it is just time to move on. Move on, and so this idea of moving on appeals in some ways not just to uh, people who are inclined to support the president, like obviously the Republicans would, uh, but it also, in some ways, it has an appeal to. In some ways, it has an appeal. This is my wife calling, and I can't answer the phone right now. But this also appeals to the desire of some people who just want to be rid of the Trump of Donald Trump. Who say, okay, let's just move on. Let's we're tired of thinking of Donald Trump. Why are we talking about him? Let's move on to something else. And so therefore, this is uh, now, well, obviously a trial is taking place. This says that vote lost. So at least a precedent has been set. But nevertheless, this is still going to be this is still an issue in this case. Okay, hold on. We'll have to do this. Hold on for just 1 second here. Hold on. My wife. Yeah. I'm in the middle of a presentation. I'm in the middle of a presentation. Okay, call me when you finish. Okay then. All right. Bye bye. My wife. All right. Okay. I had to answer that. I apologize for that. Okay. So let's examine the logic of this idea, whether or not it makes sense to try a former president and was president. And so my approach, looking at this, well, first of all, we're gonna do a sort of constitutional analysis, and I'm going to use two approaches to the Constitution interpretation, what we call originalism and also textualism. I'll explain what those are. And one of the benefits of using these two approaches is that in many cases, these are two approaches to the Constitution that are particularly lauded oftentimes by conservative jurists when they interpret the Constitution. So we're going to use those two approaches of analyzing the Constitution and partly to address this question. Secondly, we're also going to consider some practical considerations that might be want to take into consideration when we're examining this question. And then thirdly, we want to examine some of the evidence, some of the evidence that are just related to this case, and then we'll try to draw some conclusions. Mhm. Now, I want to start off first of all with originalism. Uh, Originalism, quite simply, is a school of constitutional interpretation that argues that the Constitution should be interpreted in terms of the intentions of the framers. So, in other words, when there are disputes involving how we interpret a particular provision of the Constitution, what we should do is to study the intention of the framers. That we want to know what the framers had in mind when certain provisions were written. Originalism assumes that the framers acted in a deliberate fashion, that they knew what they were doing, that they chose their words carefully. Uh, and originals also assume that the intentions of the framers are things that can be discerned. In other words, that if we study the history of the times or and the debates surrounding these provisions and the context in which they occurred, like with the term, the writings of the framers, then we can divine what the framers' intentions are, and the assumption is that knowledge matters. It matters. So consequently, so therefore, controversies therefore that we have in the present should then be resolved based upon the principles that we can derive from our study of the framers' intent. In other words, so it assumes that it assumes that there are principles from the framers' intent that we can extract, and those principles are principles that we should apply when we're dealing with controversies that we have in the present. And an approach to constitutional interpretation that's been particularly lauded by many conservatives and conservative uh, jurists who argue that the study of the framer's intent, the original intent, is not only the best way, but some argue that it's really like the only way uh, that we should be viewing and interpreting the Constitution when we're trying to apply that to the current controversy that we have among them. So many conservatives have particularly uh, uh, hung their hat on originalism and have used that as a metric when, for example, trying to decide who should be a Supreme Court justice. So, so that's a basic definition of originalism. Originalism. Now let's try to apply this originalism to the idea of impeachment. Okay. Uh, First of all, with impeachment, our notions of impeachment are rooted, first of all, in British history. The framers, uh, almost up until the point that they decided to revolt from Great Britain, were British subjects. English history was their history. And so they were quite learned about many of the precedents related, that derive from their British constitutional past, and so so obviously many that their ideas about impeachment came from England. England. Impeachment was a device, a method that had been used in the 1600s and especially the 1700s, and this is something that the framers would have been well aware of. It applied to a number of high level officials. Officials. Uh, However, it did not apply to the king. The king. Uh, king. Uh, Parliament did have the power to impeach former officials. In fact, really about all of the impeachments that the framers probably would have been familiar with would have been of former officials. Literally, at the time that the Constitutional Convention was being drafted, the British Parliament was actually in the process of impeaching a former official. He was actually the governor general from the British colony of India at the time. He was accused of corruption. And so he was impeached and tried and tried, even though he had been out of office actually for 2 years. In this case, this was actually happening contemporaneously with the Constitutional Convention. The framers were of this, aware of this at the time that they were debating this. The and the fact that no one expressed the view that this impeachment was illegitimate is probably good. It's probably perhaps good evidence, evidence that the framers did not necessarily believe that impeachment, the power of impeachment, stopped when a person's term necessarily expired. Impeachment, of course, was not simply about being removal from office. Impeachment was also about potential possibility of disqualification for the convicted person from ever serving again, however, in Britain, not only the Parliament had the power uh, to impeach, to convict someone and remove them from office, also to disqualify them from office, but Parliament also had the ability to impose criminal sanctions on the individual who had been convicted. And so one of the things that we do know. So one of the things we can say is impeachment did come from British sources and was influenced by British. The Americans kept certain, perhaps kept some of the concepts with impeachment and modified others. For example, for example, impeachment applied to the president, whereas in Britain, the impeachment did not apply to the king. But it did apply to the president. And they also would limit the authority of the United States Senate, something I'm going to mention a little later, by limiting the penalties that they could impose to simply remove them from office and the possible and also disqualification. They would take away from the Senate. They would not copy the British in giving them additionally the power to impose criminal penalties. Penalties. You know what? So it's so I think it can be argued from at least from an originalist interpretation of impeachment from the history that there's really no evidence from an original standpoint that the framers' original understanding of impeachment would have barred the trying of someone who was no longer in office. So that's looking at it from an originalist standpoint. Okay, what happens when we look at it from a textual standpoint? Okay, let's talk about textualism, which is also another approach to constitutional interpretation that is oftentimes lauded by conservatives. Uh, Textualism is an approach to constitutional interpretation that basically says that the meaning of the Constitution should be discerned through an examination of the plain meaning of the text of the document. Sometimes it's also referred to as literalism. In other words, the Constitution means what it says. What it says. What it says. So simply the plain meaning of the words of the Constitution is how is what textualists argue. Again, this is a favorite of conservatives. So when we use textualism, we're looking at a textual analysis of the Constitution. Let's go to the relevant section of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7. Clause 7, this is the part of the Article 1 that talks about the Senate. Uh, Judgments, quote, judgments in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to the law. This is again Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7. Clause 7. I want to just focus in on here on what it says and what it doesn't say. The language here, judgments in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy, office of honor, trust, and profit. In other words, from my the reading of this passage is really more about putting a limitation on the power of the Senate to say, for example, the Senate may not impose criminal penalties on someone who is being convicted. Actually, that would actually violate another part of the Constitution, which prevents the Congress from enacting what we call bills of attainder, which are with laws which actually provide for criminal penalties against individuals, actually some individuals who are named without a judicial finding. This, that's what this would amount to. So actually, his idea, so his idea is more about limiting the power of the Senate. So that's really the overall context of this. First of all, of the section, but more specifically, uh, the language says that the judgments can no longer stand up no further than removal and disqualification. The language does not necessarily require, for example, that the person who is the subject of it still be in office. It says rather the sense of this clause is that you Senate, you can go no further than to remove from office and to disqualify. That's what it's saying. You know, so removal and disqualifications are two distinct penalties that the Senate that the Senate may impose. If the framers, according to a textual approach, if the framers had intended to intended to state that impeachments only apply to those who are currently in office. So consequently, you must first of all be in office first to be removed. And then upon removal, then we can vote on whether or not you be disqualified. Well, if that is what the framers intended that to mean, well, they could have written it that way if they wanted to, but they didn't. So at least from a textual standpoint, different from the text on there, one could argue. I think I think quite plausibly that these are two distinct penalties. Except especially if you combine it with a sort of an originalist understanding. So so in that sense, you can argue that not only is there a originalist basis, it can be argued that there's also a textual basis for proceeding as the Senate has decided to do with the current impeachment, which is impeachment and trial now, which is now taking place. So that's So that's the constitutional analysis that I wanted to bring from an original standpoint first, and then from a textual approach. Now, what I can do is turn away from constitutional analysis and towards some more practical considerations. considerations. Uh, let's consider what might be the practical implications of the Rand Paul position that was adopted by uh, the overwhelming majority of the Republican members of the United States Senate only about a week or so ago. If former presidents cannot be tried, if that was the precedent that was set, uh, one of the potential implications of this is that future presidents might be incentivized to save their most egregious offenses against the Constitution until the waning days of their administrations. In other words, let's wait until the clock's about to run out. Let's wait until the last few weeks or days of the administration to reserve some of the most egregious violations of the Constitution, or maybe we'll just resign. Maybe we'll just resign. We'll just resign. And so therefore, if if impeachment requires, first of all, removal, impeachment and conviction requires removal, and but we can move to the issue of disqualification. Well, if I'm no longer in office, you know, we might be able to escape accountability. Uh, the effect of that ultimately could make the president above the law. And based on everything that we know, at least we think we know about the framers and what they were trying to accomplish, that was seen to go against everything that they stood for. After all, the whole revolution was supposedly about overturning tyranny. A lot of things they were doing were animated by their fear of tyranny. And so after throwing off one king whom they considered a tyrant, the last thing the framers wanted was to allow another tyrant to emerge on America's own soil. So it seemed like that doesn't count. That would seem like that make a whole lot of sense. Uh, that the framers, framers would have wanted to do that. Do that. So first of all, former presidents might be incentivized to say their most egregious offenses until the very end, in the belief that they'll get away with it, and nothing will happen to them. You know, in this case in particular, in Trump's case, this would amount to excusing the actions of a president who deliberately tried to subvert the peaceful transfer of power, uh, who tried essentially to nullify the votes of millions of Americans. Ultimately, the January 6th rally that turned into an insurrection really was a culmination of an effort, a months-long effort by Donald Trump, who used both legal and illegal means to attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Presidential election. And so, one of the practical implications, particularly in a particular case, would be to not try him in the Senate. Would be in effect excusing him uh, for really deliberately undermining the faith of a large segment of the American population in the integrity of their own elections. And it's kind of hard to imagine that the framers would have thought that someone who tried to undermine Americans' confidence in the reliability of their own elections is not someone who will be subject to impeachment. Finally, uh, the failure both to try and convict Donald Trump could leave our system vulnerable to future presidential election losers, election losers who try similar things. What about uh, the next person who loses the presidential election? You know, the if they see the example of, say, of Donald Trump not being held accountable for this, maybe they'll try it. And worse, perhaps the next person will succeed. Perhaps the first person will be a little smarter. Maybe they'll plan it out a little better. Uh, and maybe they might get people to go along with it uh, in ways that this president or this current president, this former president failed to do so. You know, so if you know, so once once you institutionalize the idea that elections don't have consequences, that losers don't have to accept the results, that and that you know, it's kind of hard to imagine how you can have a healthy democracy in a nation in which elections don't matter and which the losers don't have to accept the results. And so so I think these are some practical considerations that also seem to point also in the direction of why this trial is necessary. Mhm. And now let's actually examine the evidence in this particular case. In particular case, um, because the charge is in inciting an insurrection based upon what happened on January the 6th. The 6th. We know that Donald Trump was spoke at a rally. They call it the Save America rally, with thousands of his supporters. They had been promoted for weeks. Uh, no, but Donald Trump wasn't just a keynote speaker who came in to speak at this rally and made some passionate remarks, and then he left. And he left. Uh, this was a rally that had been organized by the White House. White House. This was a rally that had been promoted on social media by the President of the United States. For weeks. For weeks, they, they lined up the speakers, for this rally. So this wasn't just some event that some random Trump supporters put together spontaneously, and the president just happened to show up. But the president and the president, promoted this. His team, they organized it. They arranged they determined who the speakers were going to be. Uh, will be. So they're deeply involved in this whole thing. Uh, this this rally occurs must be understood in the context that the president himself had spent months, and this actually goes before the election, prior to the election, telling his supporters, that elections might be rigged. Donald Trump said on more than one occasion that he suspected that the election would be fraudulent. That he said that if he lost, that it would be because the election was rigged, that it was stolen from him. So he sort of prepared his supporters not only for the possibility that he might lose, but if he lost, to not accept the results. The result. As a result. And of course, he did lose the election, uh, and and when he did lose the election, he cried fraud. He then again he pounded the pavement. They with accusations of widespread voter fraud in the election. Was conspiracy theorists, his allies complied. They filled the airways with a lot of these allegations. The president has allies filed over 60 lawsuits in states and federal courts around the country. These lawsuits were categorically rejected. Rejected. I mean, not. I mean, they were dismissed for lack of evidence, for the the appalling failure to produce any evidence to support their allegations. Yet, even and yet, however, after being rebuffed by the courts, you know, and after the electoral college votes were certified in the states, the president still persisted. He pressured state and federal officials to to essentially to overturn the election results. Uh, we've heard about repeated efforts, approaching officials in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and finally, probably the most infamous one is the call he made to the Georgia Secretary of State, in which he was pressuring the Georgia Secretary of State to come up with 11,780 votes, the exact number he needed to overturn the results of the state of Georgia and award those electoral votes to him instead of Joe Biden, who had been declared the winner. Uh, winner. And so, and so he, so, he continued this. In the days leading up to the January 6th rally, the president continued. The president began to uh, falsely maintain that Vice President Mike Pence had the power to unilaterally uh, uh, reject the votes from some of the swing states. And so he put this out repeatedly on social media. He did it on social media, and he lobbied him, personally, to try to do this. And he made several references to this during the rally itself. Of course, Mike Pence then would say that he did not have that power, that the role that the vice president has during the certification of electoral votes is mostly a ministerial role. The vice president does not have the authority to determine the validity of electoral votes in any state, any state. But yet the president repeated this fiction over and over and over. And so his followers came to the conclusion that somehow Mike Pence was somehow betraying the Constitution, when actually that was actually not true. Uh, the president also knew that these groups were violent. Were violent. The president's social media operation followed and tracked a lot of the groups who were coming to this rally, and many of them were very clear that their intentions were violent. They made no intention. They made no attempt to hide this. These things were openly discussed on social media, and so the Trump's social media operation were following the activities of these groups who were planning to come to Washington. And so in light of these facts, it's strange credulity to argue that the president could not have known that the use of incendiary language at the January 6th event would would have the likely effect of motivating people to commit acts of violence and to actually storm the Capitol. Is that so that mhm. After we continue.
What you walking around like that for? Like you.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. When we examine further, once the violent assault began, again, that's not what I'm saying. The president did nothing to stop it. In fact, he actually ignored frantic appeals, both from there were lawmakers, people within the Capitol. You had some of his own aides
For money back, I ain't going to answer the phone. Everybody going to voicemail.
Okay.
Everybody figure out. When I told him about selling the oil, oh, he ain't want.
Someone needs to mute their mic.
Have something. Don't ask me for no doggone money. And see, wait, I gotta finish this though.
Someone needs to mute their mic. Thank you. There were former officials in the administration, like Kellyanne Conway, like Mick Mulvaney, who reached out to the White House, said, "Mr. President, please intervene, stop this. Chris Christie, please, Mr. President, stop this." He didn't even check on his own vice president, who was with his family at the Capitol as violent supporters were literally hunting for him. They had built a noose for him. They said they were going to kill him. They never called us. He never called. On the phone. The president did not send the National Guard as Capitol Police were valiantly fighting and being overwhelmed by the mobs that was streaming in. And when help finally came, it came hours later. But it was no thanks to the president. Not only did the president not do nothing to stop the violence, but the president seemed to welcome the violence. In fact, his statements afterwards really praised the insurrectionists. He didn't really condemn them for their actions. Now, but what about the First Amendment? Some people argue, well, the president's not responsible because he made a speech, and his Trump lawyers are saying that his speech was protected speech under the First Amendment, and he's not responsible for what happened afterwards. In other words, that the people who did these things, who actually acted, they're the ones that should be held accountable. And the argument here is that the precedent that will be set will be that if we convict Donald Trump, it means that any passionate speaker could be prosecuted for simply expressing their views. These arguments are patently ridiculous. First of all, the First Amendment, yes, the First Amendment does provide broad protections for the free expression of ideas. Even this applies to unpopular ideas. In fact, the First Amendment would mean nothing, very little, if it only applied to popular ideas. The First Amendment protects unpopular ideas, even incorrect ideas. But the First Amendment has limits. There is no constitutionally protected right to incite violence. We have the great precedent of Brandenburg versus Ohio, for example. So speech can be limited, and speech that incites violence can be prosecuted and is not protected First Amendment speech. People who incite violence oftentimes are held accountable by law enforcement for their actions. And the president, if a president does that, in this case, the president should not be treated any differently from any other citizen. It's endless. Again, given what we know, the president cannot claim that he did not know that some of the intentions of these rioters were violent, or that he could not anticipate how his words would be interpreted, and that his use of incendiary language, some of the incendiary language, like in the speech, would not result in the things that actually happened on January the 6th. And so really to accept the president's position, and the position his lawyers are articulating, that somehow the president is not responsible, that his speech was protected, was protected, that that he's not responsible for what people after him did. You would have to believe in a whole lot of absurd legalisms, like, well, he didn't actually say storm the Capitol, on the Capitol, you know, even though he used the word fight over 20 times in speech. He referred to peace walk over only once. Even though you know even though we know that his social media operation was following these violent and extremist groups, even though Donald Trump's brand politically, ever since he ran for president, that the president has welcomed political violence. He has celebrated political violence. He encouraged people at his rallies to attack protesters, to attack the media, attack the media. He celebrated some of his supporters who tried to run a Biden campaign team bus off the road. And said, "I love Texas." So Texas. So given the whole totality of things, it's just simple. It's simply not credible. This argument that the president could not have anticipated uh, uh, how his words might be interpreted. You would have to believe that words are meaningless and they have no context, and that and they have no consequence. And it's interesting, that some of the same people who are saying who were holding Democrats responsible for violence at Black Lives Matter demonstrations, accusing Democrats of, of irresponsible rhetoric, that they're responsible for those things. Now say that President Trump should get a mulligan for what happened on January the 6th. So we've gone from believing that words matter. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Words, powerful words, some of the most powerful words in American history, to words don't matter. Uh, he was just kidding. He was just playing. Words don't matter. No, words have consequence. So the First Amendment is, while it will be argued by Trump defense team, but I don't think it's a very good argument in this particular case. So here's our conclusion. Both from an original standpoint, the Constitution demonstrates that impeachments, at least in the mind framers, are not simply limited to current office holders. From a textual standpoint of the Constitution, that also does not support the contention that one must be in office to be impeached. Uh, it, this actually strengthens the significance of the disqualification penalty that the Senate may impose on a convicted official in some ways. So again, the framers had intended for the Constitution to bar uh, trials, impeachment and trials for those who were not currently in office. They had the ability to specifically state that, but they did not do so. Uh, Finally, not trying ex-presidents, uh, in this case, would effectively incentivize egregious behavior at the end of presidential terms, or could encourage presidents who have been defeated at the ballot box to seek to overthrow the results of the election. Election, and it's hard to imagine that you can have democracy if elections don't matter. Finally, the January 6th insurrection was actually the culmination of a months-long campaign to delegitimize the election. which the president feared he would lose, and that he actually did in fact lose. But nevertheless, he continued to stoke the notion, the false notion that the election had been stolen from him, and pursue legal and illegal means to try to overturn that result. Uh, Finally, not only did Trump incite the mob, but once the mob did attack the Capitol, not only did he do nothing to stop it, but he seemed to actually welcome the violence, and he did not condemn the insurrectionists. Uh, Therefore, and that's it. Not only is this trial legitimate, not only am I conclude, but I believe the evidence suggests that not only that Trump should be convicted based on the evidence, but also but someone who has clearly shown that they have no respect for the democratic rules of the game. Basic to that is that if you run from office, you must accept the fact that there's a possibility that you may lose. And if you lose, you have to accept the results. Someone who has done that should never hold office again. And I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop sharing. That concludes my portion of what I have to say. And now the floor is open for now the floor is open for questions and comments.
Well done, Doc.
Okay. Any?
Yeah,
I had a comment, but
go ahead. I'll follow up when you're done, Dr.
no, go ahead,
Contreras.
go ahead, Dean. Go ahead, Dean. I was just trying to remember what I was thinking about, and I just forgot. So you go ahead.
All right, Prof. Thank you very much. But I want to join you to say, Dr. Samuel, thank you very much. Maybe the House managers should have included you in the team to prosecute number 45. I still hate to call him ex-president. I thought you did a very good job, but I have a question for you and for my colleagues. From what we've already heard, you really summarized very neatly with strong evidential points. But Republicans are still unmoved.
Mm-hmm.
They're really determined to quit this guy. What impact do you think, this is just your opinion, how would the Republican from now on go on? Because they're still afraid of their base. The base still supports Trump. What do you think is going to happen to the Republican Party down the line?
Okay. That's a very good question, obviously, and I'm gonna take a stab at that. If you have not seen the House manager's presentation from yesterday or parts of that, I encourage you to look at that, because the House manager's presentation was very powerful, and we saw some things, and senators actually saw things that they hadn't seen before. They had a pretty tall, in some ways, the House manager had a tall task to try to present to us something that we thought we already knew, but they put it all together in a powerful way. And so, whether or not it moves Republicans, there were a few people who already made comments, but they made, but to this point, we still don't know if they are representative of their caucus or they're just mouthing off. Like, and there's some people we know are beyond being reached. But the power of that presentation is one of the reasons why people say never underestimate the power of trials, because but it will. But however, it will say something uh, very powerful about the Republicans if, in the face of the case that was presented. Obviously, the president is going to also has his team will start speaking tomorrow, and so and then we'll see how the trial goes. And so obviously, many members of the Senate, should reserve judgment court completely until the entire trial ends. Trial ends. But I do think I do think that I do think, but if we assume that the Republicans decide to acquit the president, if they don't reach the 17 Republicans necessary to convict the president, assuming that all 50 Democrats are going to go along, again, then I think, then I think that one thing that means is that Donald Trump still holds a stranglehold on the Republican Party,
True,
on the party,
he does.
on the Republican Party, and it'd be interesting. How the because I think now, if you're going to, you could argue. I use the originalist arguments and the textual arguments because these are arguments that conservatives like to use. Now, we don't always agree with the framers' intent. Sometimes, sometimes the framers, sometimes we don't. We think the framers were not right about everything, and so, but the interesting, so it's possible that you could say, well, maybe the framers were wrong about this. Wrong about this. Now, I can imagine what theory you come up with, but certainly the argument that the Republicans have put forward is that it's just inherently unconstitutional to try a president who's no longer in office. Really doesn't have any basis. That doesn't have any basis. Now, there may be another basis you can argue, where you can argue, well, maybe the framers weren't correct. That can be plausible. In other words, if you were trying to, I'm saying this, if you were searching for a principle that can be used, but my suspicion is that the real problem for the Republican Party is that they have no principle, because I mean, most of this breastbeating, as I read it, about this notion that there's no principle, that there's no basis, or you can't impeach a president long in office. That sounds like a principle, because it's better than talking about what the president actually did. And there's no doubt in my mind that if the tables had been reversed, that if a Democrat had done what President Trump is accused of, not only would this Republican Party convict him, try and convict him, but they would forget that they ever said that a president can't be tried after he's no longer in office. Remember, these are the same people who said, "Oh no, you should never nominate a Supreme Court justice during the middle of a political campaign." And then as soon as Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, she hadn't been dead for an hour before Mitch McConnell was already planning how to replace her weeks before the election. So we didn't really mean that. Oh, we meant that only if the Senate and the White House are of the same party, then that rule doesn't apply.
I know, I know. It's a very hypocritical party. I mean, we know that.
So I don't believe so. But I think that I think that's a real problem for. I think the Republican Party that's a real problem. It's a real problem. Now, honestly, now Republicans, now to some degree, Republicans don't think they have a problem. Because to some, because other than, some of them argue that, hey, Donald Trump may have lost, but we actually gained seats in the House. Nancy Pelosi has a very slim majority in the House, despite predictions that the Democrats would certainly flip the Senate. It took two runoff elections in Georgia for them to actually get to a 50-50 tie, and the vice president breaking the tie. So some Republicans think that, well, we're really not too bad off. So if we can have Trumpism without Trump, we're not that far away from taking everything back.
True.
So so some Republicans and their own capitalists may not think they're that bad off.
You're right. Very, very good analysis. And that's why they are behaving the way they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Other comments?
Dr. Samuels, we have some questions in the chat box. The first question comes from Marcus Virgil, who asks, how do you think the transfer of power will go for President Joe Biden with the stance that Trump has taken?
Well, obviously he's president now, but obviously we had a very bumpy transition. For weeks, the Trump administration refused to acknowledge that Joe Biden had won the election, and so they wouldn't even cooperate with the transition. And then weeks later, they finally they started cooperating, but then some parts of the administration cooperated better than others.
Right.
Better than others. So it has been bumpy, and obviously things would have been a whole lot smoother had we'd had a normal transition of power. That did slow some things down. So for example, the Biden administration was not able to get the full handle on what the Trump administration was doing as related to the coronavirus pandemic. Well, so until they actually got in office, and then they realized that they'd done pretty much nothing. That afterwards, Operation Warp Speed was more about trying to get a vaccine. There was literally no plan on how to distribute it once the vaccine had been developed. We're just gonna give it to the states and let the states, you figure it out. Good luck. And so it certainly would have been better had they had cooperation, say from November, about some of these things, so that they could hit the ball running. And of course, and those things, those kind of things are costly, and especially in the midst of a pandemic, people are losing lives. Lost. We're losing like 3,000 people a day. That's a 9/11 every day because of this pandemic. So there have been some costs into that. To some degree, one benefit has been that Joe Biden is the most experienced person to ever be elected president of the United States, and so that's actually one benefit they had, is that this wasn't a group of people for whom this was their first rodeo, but still it would have been better if we had the kind of cooperation that you would normally expect. But then again, we were dealing with an administration or a president who refused, and who's even to this day still refuses to admit that he lost the election.
Okay. Professor Cottrell can unmute himself and talk because he said he had a comment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I should go before him.
Oh. I'm sorry, Professor Smith. He said he thumbs up. He said you can go before him.
I really just want to make a comment, which I think is profound, from Hillary Clinton when she said if Senate Republicans fail to convict Donald Trump, it won't be because the facts were with him or his lawyers mounted a competent defense. It will be because the jury includes his co-conspirators.
Yeah. Well, I think you have members of some members of the Senate, in particularly Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz,
Yeah.
who gave oxygen to Trump's baseless theory that the election had been stolen. Actually, Mitch McConnell bears responsibility too, because even though he knew that Joe Biden had won, for weeks they humored Donald Trump as he pursued what they knew were pointless lawsuits. So, what's the harm? He'll get out of his system, and so that's been and this again, it's been part of a pattern by Republicans in Congress, especially Senate Republicans, of turning the other way, excusing, pretending they didn't see, pretending they didn't hear, pretending it wasn't as bad, and so in many ways they created the context for Donald Trump to think that he can get away with it.
Yes.
Okay. Was that it, Professor Smith?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. All right, Professor Cottrell.
Oh, well, like I said in the text, it was in so much of the questions and comment. I mean, we saw this originalism and textualism stuff that Doc has explained very thoroughly way back when, and with selective application by number 45 and Republicans going after Obama with regard to his legitimacy to be president, how they interpreted the natural born phrase in Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the only phrase that tells you whether or not you can be president geographically in that aspect, but then they kept trying to use the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments applying it, and then lying about that as well. So these guys are just all over the place. Doc, comment on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's true, and I think that keep in mind Donald Trump began his political career with a lie. The whole birtherism. He became the nation's most foremost spokesman for the lie that Barack Obama was not a citizen of the United States. And he continued for years to push that idea. And even when he finally in the campaign in 2016, when he finally said, well, Barack Obama is a citizen of the United States, he still lied about it. He claimed that Hillary Clinton started it.
Yeah. But with regard to Article 2, though, the president only has to be natural born, and that's the only one. It doesn't say anything about where you're born. John McCain was born in the Panama Canal Zone outside the territorial United States, but still under its jurisdiction. Ted Cruz was born in Canada, but all three of them were natural born, meaning born to American citizens. So they just obfuscate and depend on the ignorance of the masses that follow them and drink their Kool-Aid, basically.
Well, again, you're right. And oftentimes, this is one of the criticisms that I kind of mentioned. I talk about this a lot of time in my common law class. Is that oftentimes when you listen to people who claim to believe in originalism, and they believe in textualism, all these other things, and sometimes while they are true believers, for many people, these are really tools that are simply designed to get to a result, and they believe in originalism until they don't, until it doesn't work for them, or they believe in textualism until they don't. They don't. So I'm taking you at your word. You claim that you believe in originalism, okay? From an originalist standpoint, my argument here is that you can't make the argument that this trial is inherently unconstitutional, based on the history. There were, based on history, the framers give no indication. There's no evidence to give any indication that you could not impeach someone who was not out of office. In fact, the only impeachments that they would have been aware of would have been of ex officials. What I didn't mention was there's also an American precedent for this, and that's the Secretary of War in 1876 was actually impeached by the House. Even though he was accused of corruption, he tried to avoid impeachment by resigning. The House impeached him anyway, because they didn't want to establish the precedent that someone could just resign to avoid being impeached. Now, he ultimately was not convicted. So we should have an American precedent also, even though it involved not a president in that case, but actually Secretary of War. We now call that person the Secretary of Defense. Okay.
Are there any more questions anyone else want to ask? Because I didn't see any more posted in our chat box. If not, then Dr. Samuels, if you don't have anything else to say. Oh, one person, Miss Stephanie Williams, said great presentation.
Okay. Yeah, that's my. Yeah, hi Stephanie. That's my friend from Incopes.
Okay. If anybody don't have anything else to say, then we'll let Dean Ejigiri give his closing remarks before we close out. Does Dean Ejigiri have anything?
Dean, do you have anything that you want to say? Kind of close this out.
He's still on mute.
I think he's still on.
He is, but his mic is still muted.
Dean, can you unmute yourself? Okay. Well, if Sister Dean, I know Sister Dean can't hear. Other than that, I want to thank you all for taking the time out of on a Thursday afternoon to listen to this, to be a part of this, and I think we should do more things like this. We'll let's see how using Trump's line. Let's just see what happens. And thank you for your attention, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Samuels.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Samuel.
Yes.
Okay, then hold on just a second. Dr. Samuel, they said hold. They're gonna check and see if the dean had anything else to say because his stuff was still on mute.
Is he still there?
He's still in the office.
Were you saying something, Miss Bobo?
They're gonna check. I called the dean's office to check to see if he had anything else to say. They said they're gonna ask him because he was still on mute.
Okay.
There he is.
I left it on mute. I don't want to disturb other people talking. No, I think Dr. Summers answered my question very well. Like I said, um, allow me the privilege to say thank you for the scholarship. I wish more of my colleagues would do exactly what you're doing. That's how to promote scholarship. No, you address my concern because let me express my own personal opinion. I'm really worried about this country and the Republican Party because those of us that have communication outside this country know what is happening better than most Americans. Believe me, the image of this country has taken a very big hit. Let me give you an example, if you don't mind. Indulge me for a second.
Sure.
There is a president in Uganda who has been there for the last 40 years, one of those idiots, don't want to give up power. And that's the type Trump wished to copy from. So there was an election last 3 weeks. And as usual, he rigged it. He wouldn't even allow his opponent to campaign. So when the press asked him that this election appeared to have been rigged, that his opponent, the opposition, was saying that this was a farce. It can never be called democracy. You know what he said? He said, oh, well, ask my opponent. I don't want him to be like Trump, who would claim that the election was rigged and would not provide evidence. So the person laughed. So Trump has become a model of stupidity and autocrat of destroying democracy. I could never have believed that someday somebody will use the United States case as an example of an abuse of democracy. So how can this country, the model of democracy, even ever have the guts to say something to any other country in the world? So the damage is far more reaching than the Republicans will ever appreciate. That's why I agreed with you that we gotta watch where this country goes from now, because the diehards still believe in Trumpism, whatever word you policy scientists will describe that. Trump's effect is still well and alive with a large number of them. But here's my opinion, strictly mine. If the 200 rioters instigators, if they will go to jail, if they will be punished, that might send up a signal to the rest of them that this is the wrong way to go. And again, Dr. Samuel, really thank you for bringing us together in making us appreciate what it is. So thank you.
Okay. Okay. Oh, all right. There is one point I want to make, and then I'm gonna close, and that is um, the very real possibility that Donald Trump goes unpunished for what took place on January the 6th. In some ways, reminds me of what happened at the end of the Civil War. Michael Beschloss, a great historian, pointed out a couple of days ago, February 9th was the 160th anniversary of Jefferson Davis becoming the president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis did spend about 2 years in jail or prison after the war, but he was never tried for treason. And he, like many Confederates, were amnestied and didn't suffer any real consequences for really, or not consequences they should have associated, for really treason against the United States government. And so Jefferson Davis, for the rest of his life, acts like we got away with it. we didn't actually we didn't really lose. We didn't really lose, and so one of the consequences of acting like it didn't happen, pretending that the war wasn't about slavery, and lying about it, was another 100 years of Jim Crow segregation and another 150 years, 60 years of sustained racism. So don't think there won't be any consequences if we just let this pass. And if the people who participated in this big lie suffer no consequences. So people really need to think about what that means. So with that, I'm done.
That's a very powerful way to conclude. Yes, that's why I'm telling you, we'll be looking forward, waiting for the consequences, because in life, if there are no consequences to incidents like this, you know, history would certainly repeat itself.
Yep. So
Hey guys, yeah, the network here in Higgins Hall completely died here, so it threw me out.
okay. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for your attention, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Samuels.